I walked into Silent Hill F thinking I knew the language. Rust, fog, radio static. But this game handed me flower petals that spread like infection and wedding silk that moves when you're not looking. This isn't the Silent Hill you memorized. It's using the same engine of guilt and projection, but the fuel is completely different. I'm here to show you the mechanics underneath the beauty, why a single fox mask can rewrite your sense of agency, how a staircase becomes a threat without ever spawning an enemy, and why a bureaucratic error in Australia turned into folklore before most of us even booted the game. I played this twice, then walked Ebisugaoka with no sound just to see what the architecture was doing to my body. We're peeling this back one layer at a time, and some of what I found genuinely unsettled me. Ebisugaoka does something I didn't expect. It makes you physically smaller. The verticality forces your camera into uncomfortable angles. Staircases switch back in ways that erase where you came from. NeoBards didn't design this, they scanned it. They reference-walked Kaneyama in Gifu Prefecture, pulling real-world geometry, then weaponized it. What makes this brilliant is that the horror isn't layered on top. The town is already adversarial before a single petal falls. Here's what I mean. Shrines sit on ridgelines that force you to climb with your back to the street. Your instincts scream at you the entire time. Paths coil in on themselves so tightly that backtracking feels like trespassing. Players who actually visited Kaneyama reported feeling disoriented in real life because the game taught them to distrust the layout first. That's not atmosphere, that's spatial conditioning. But let's talk about what the stairs are actually doing here, because this is where the game gets theological. Stairs in Japanese shrine architecture represent transition between profane and sacred space. You climb to purify. You ascend to meet something greater. F perverts that symbolism systematically. Every staircase in Ebisugaoka promises elevation and delivers confinement. You climb toward light and arrive in smaller rooms. You ascend for perspective and lose sightlines. There's a specific moment in the middle section where you climb a long shrine staircase, probably 80, 90 steps, and at the top there's just a door to a basement. The game made you work for descent. That inversion isn't subtle, but it's effective because by that point you've internalized the rule. Up means trapped, down means deeper. There's no escape axis. The architecture is a maze where every direction is inward. The devs talked about studying Escher for this, which tracks, but the more relevant reference is Piranesi's carcery, prisons made of stairs that go nowhere. F builds that same impossibility, but masks it with functionality. Every staircase works, every door opens, but the logic connecting them is deliberately wrong, just wrong enough that you can't articulate why you feel lost when you can see your objective. Players who've tried to map Ebisugaoka report the same thing. The map works locally, but fails globally. Sections make sense until you try to connect them, and then the geometry lies. That's not a glitch. That's the town performing non-Euclidean space on you without the sci-fi excuse. You're not in an alternate dimension. You're in a town that won't let you leave, using nothing but stairs and doors. The audio deserves your full attention. They recorded on site, cicadas, whetstone reverb, wind scraping narrow alleys, so when the other world corrupts it later, your body recognizes the deviation before your brain does. The town makes a sonic contract with you, then breaks it with flowers. You'll feel the breach in your spine. And here's something nobody mentions. Where is everyone? Ebisugaoka is a town. Towns have people. F shows you empty streets, closed shops, shrines with no priests. The game treats this absence as normal, and that's the creepiest choice. You're in a depopulated space, and no one in narrative remarks on it. This maps to actual rural Japan. Towns like Kaneyama are experiencing depopulation. Young people leave, infrastructure decays, buildings empty but don't get torn down. They just sit. F takes that real demographic collapse and makes it supernatural without changing much. The horror is that you can't tell where the real abandonment ends and the other world begins. Maybe the town was already dying. Maybe the flowers just claimed what was already empty. There's a bench near the central shrine that has a jacket draped over it. It's been there in every act. No one ever comes back for it. Small details like that Evidence of people who left or vanished are scattered everywhere if you look. The game is showing you a place that's already post-apocalyptic in slow motion. The monsters didn't empty the town. Economics and time did. The monsters just moved into the vacancy. Here's the mission statement that should worry you. Make it beautiful first, then let beauty go wrong. Director Al Yang said that, and the team executed it with surgical precision. Silent Hill has always externalized trauma, guilt as rust, denial as fog. F inverts the material palette entirely. Instead of decay, you get bloom. Instead of sirens, you get sustained tones that pulse like sap rising through dead wood. The red spider lily, Lycoris radiata, marks graves in Japanese tradition. It's called the flower of the other shore. The art team didn't just reference this, they made it a colonizing force. When you see petals in the classroom, that's not set dressing. That's a claim of ownership. The room is being repurposed while you stand in it. What they don't do is the masterstroke. No visible seam to the other world. No rust spreading across walls. No alarm transition. A space remains itself while stems grow inside the furniture. The horror is conceptual, beauty refusing to stay decorative. That restraint keeps the 1960s setting honest. The terror doesn't come from another dimension, it comes from this one, rotting from the inside while maintaining its face. Now watch what happens with the lighting. There's a shift that happens in F that most players feel but don't consciously track. The game opens in warm, late afternoon tones, gold hour light, nostalgic color grading that your brain files under safe. It looks like a memory you'd want to. Keep then, degree by degree, the temperature cools, not dramatically, not with a transition that says, now you should be scared, just incrementally across hours of play until you're in a cold blue-white palette that makes your shoulders tense without knowing why. This is classical conditioning on a color level. The game is training you to associate warmth with the past and cold with the present. By the time you reach the dark shrine, the color temperature is basically clinical, the white of a hospital, the blue of a morgue, and your body is preloaded to read that as threat because the game spent 6 hours teaching you the language. But here's where it gets clever. Late game flashback sequences return to that warm gold palette and it doesn't feel safe anymore. It feels corrupt, because now you know that warmth was the breeding ground. The rot started in the golden hour. The cold isn't the disease, it's the symptom. That recontextualization happens silently. You don't get a cutscene explaining it. You just stand in a warm lit memory and feel your skin crawl because the game taught you that beauty here is always in the process of betrayal. The technical execution is subtle enough that it works on people who don't normally respond to color psychology. I watched a colorblind streamer describe feeling wrong in the final act without being able to articulate why. That's the design working below conscious threshold. You don't need to see the color shift to feel the temperature change. Kensuke Image's score creeps instead of crashes. Akira Yamaoka built the melancholy foundation we recognize, but Image seeds the corruption with sounds that suggest organic growth. You're not being chased by machinery, you're being overgrown, and here's what makes Yamaoka's contribution fascinating. What he doesn't do, he's synonymous with Silent Hill's sound, industrial noise, melancholic piano, that specific fog mood. For F, he pulled back. He gave the other world less. Image takes more of the sonic space, and Yamaoka's contribution becomes foundational rather than dominant. By withholding the Yamaoka sound for most of the runtime, the game trains you to listen for it. When it finally arrives in the late game, it doesn't feel triumphant. It feels like confirmation of something you'd been dreading. The sound design is telling you, yes, this is that kind of doomed. The familiar motifs become diagnosis rather than flavor. You're not nostalgic when you hear them. You're resigned. Image's work does something I haven't heard in horror games before. He uses binaural recording techniques to play sound outside the normal stereo field. If you play with headphones, there are moments where audio sources feel like they're behind your head, outside the game space. It's a spatial trick that breaks the fourth wall subtly. The horror isn't just in the game, it's in your room. There's also extensive use of infrasound, frequencies below 20 Hz that you can't consciously hear, but that your body responds to with unease. It's the same frequency range that makes people report haunted feelings in certain buildings. F weaponizes it during the bloom. Sequences. You can't hear the threat, but your inner ear registers it, and your nervous system flags the space as wrong. That's not atmospheric, that's biological hacking. Everyone asks the wrong question about Foxmask. Who is he? The better question is, what does he do? Because functionally, he's a contract written in folklore. Kitsune in Japanese mythology are intermediaries. They broker deals between mortals and power. Foxmask behaves like a lawyer who keeps rewriting terms mid-negotiation. He offers rescue in ritual language, then charges you in autonomy. The doll warns you not to trust him. Of course she does. She's the fine print you scrolled past. Here's the design brilliance. His best scenes aren't combat, they're ceremonial. The game wants you standing still while you agree to things you don't understand. That's Silent Hill's thesis made flesh, externalizing the internal habit of surrendering yourself. In SH2, it was denial. In F, it's acquiescence dressed as destiny. He's not just a villain, he's the system that profits when grief looks for an owner. When you're so exhausted, you'll sign anything that promises an exit. Watch how he speaks, formal, gentle, the tone of someone explaining why you have no choice and making you thank him for the clarity. That's not supernatural possession, that's institutional coercion in a mask. Now here's a small design choice with huge implications. Foxmask appears in confrontation scenes, and your instinct, trained by decades of games, is to figure out how to hurt him. The game never gives you that option. No health bar, no hit reaction, no feedback loop that says violence is the answer. He's not a boss fight, he's a weather system. You don't defeat weather, you endure it or leave. That removal of the combat solution forces you into the only interaction the game wants you to have with him. Negotiation. And negotiation means language, and language means he sets the terms. You can't fight someone who won't engage on that axis. You have to talk, and talking means entering his framework. That's the trap. Some players found this frustrating. Let me fight back. But that frustration is the point. The game is showing you a form of power that doesn't care about your metal pipe. He's not stronger than you. He's operating in a different category. And your tools don't work on him because he's not a physical problem. He's a contractual one. You can't hit a contract. You can only refuse to sign. But the game has spent hours teaching you that refusal has consequences too. That's the no-win geometry F specializes in. Every option costs you something. The best choice is the one where you lose the least. That's not an empowerment fantasy. That's adult life in a wedding dress. You know a hallway is working when you slow down without the game telling you to. F uses 3 specific tricks that mess with your navigation instincts. First, sightline theft. Ladder turns and stare angles force you to recenter the camera every few meters. You can't establish spatial confidence. Second, exit blindness. Doorways are 10 to 15% darker than the room you're in, so your eye flags the next space as hostile. Third, and this one's cruel, return stutter. You backtrack after a story beat and the geometry is identical, but the audio bed is 2 to 3 decibels heavier, or a chair has moved. Nothing supernatural, just enough wrongness that you mistrust your own survey. The game is training you to doubt what you know. That's why even experienced players freeze during the first bloom sequence. You can memorize a hallway and still feel it arguing with you. This design philosophy also explains the melee-heavy combat. A metal pipe in a stairwell too narrow to swing properly forces proximity. Guns create distance. F wants you elbow to elbow with things that shouldn't breathe. You survive by managing your shoulders, not your ammo. That's posture horror. Your body becomes the failure point. But let's dig deeper into what combat is actually doing here, because it's not about skill expression. It's about forcing you into postures your body knows are wrong. When you swing a pipe in a stairwell that's 30% too narrow, you're not fighting an enemy, you're fighting geometry. Your shoulder clips the wall, your follow-through dies mid-arc. The game is showing you that your body doesn't fit the space the town wants you in. This connects to something the devs mentioned in passing that nobody picked up on. They motion captured the combat animations in actual narrow corridors. The actors kept flinching, kept checking their shoulders, kept abbreviating their swings. NeoBards kept that hesitation in the final animations. Your character fights like someone who knows they're trapped, not like someone executing techniques. That nervous energy bleeds into your hands. The enemy design supports this. Creatures don't charge. They advance with the patience of something that knows you can't leave. They occupy space rather than attack through it. When you finally connect with a hit, there's no satisfying crunch. There's a wet, resistive sound, like striking something that's already rotting from the inside. The feedback tells you that violence here doesn't solve problems. It just makes the problem touch you. And here's the kicker. Late game enemies stop reacting to damage the way you expect. They don't stagger proportionally. Sometimes they pause. Sometimes they ignore it entirely. The game is removing the contract that combat usually offers. Hit enough, win eventually. F breaks that agreement. You can do everything right and still end up in a corner with something breathing on you that won't die on schedule. That's not difficulty. That's removing the power fantasy until all that's left is survival that feels like failure. The first time the shiromuku moved, I stopped the recording to make sure I wasn't seeing things. In Shinto weddings, that white silk represents purity and new beginnings. In certain regional practices, it also dresses the dead. F fuses both edges deliberately. The bride isn't a monster for spectacle. She's a thesis statement. If purity is an ideal that ignores suffering, it will rot from the inside and wear the decay like lace. Walk into the corridor lined with bridal garments. Pause the audio. Your brain will still supply breath. That's not a bug. The dark shrine uses ambient suggestion to imply lungs even when the room is empty. Your nervous system fills the gap. Now the possession angle. Western players jump to werewolf, but the closer cultural read is kitsunetsuki, possession that feels like guidance. The mask doesn't attack. It coaxes. It offers. That's why the doll's warnings hit differently. She speaks like a child, but she's the only adult voice in the room. You keep muting her because the mask sounds more certain. Community threads call him the groom deity, and that's accurate in the worst way. Coercion doesn't always look violent. Sometimes it wears ceremony's clothes and asks you to dress for the occasion. You don't fight it, you prepare for it. And when you do, the flowers take your house. But I want to go back to the bride's movement because there's a detail in her animation that I didn't catch until the second playthrough. She moves like a woman in restrictive clothing, trying not to damage the garment. That sounds obvious, but think about what that means. The monster is performing carefulness. She's preserving the dress while she kills you. That split priority, violence constrained by decorum, is more disturbing than if she just attacked efficiently. It suggests consciousness, not animal aggression, but human priority dysfunction. She cares more about the dress than about you, and she'll kill you in a way that keeps the silk clean. That's not monster behavior, that's ritual behavior. The animation team mo-capped this with an actress in an actual shiromuku, which limited her movement naturally, but then they added something, micro adjustments, little tugs at the sleeve, a hand smoothing the hem, gestures that brides make unconsciously during ceremonies because they've been taught the dress is precious and their body is the problem if it doesn't fit. The monster inherited those behaviors. She's still performing femininity while she's killing you. This connects to player reports of feeling guilty during the encounter. Not scared, guilty, like they're disrupting something important. The bride isn't just attacking you. She's showing you that you're the intrusion in her ritual, and her ritual matters more than your survival. That power dynamic, where the victim is framed as the inconvenience, is gendered horror at its most surgical. The endings don't twist, they audit. They show you who narrated your choices and how much of yourself you rented to the mask to escape the corridor. That's not a gotcha, that's a receipt. Here's what F actually tests. Can you tolerate not knowing who's lying? There's a pattern in playthroughs that's almost predictable. Early confidence, mid-game hedging, late-game ritual compliance. By the time you reach the shrine confrontations, you're pre-compromised. That's the elegant cruelty, ambiguity fatigue. The longer you live with partial information, the more you outsource your decisions to anyone who sounds authoritative. Foxmask talks like the answer key, so does the doll. F makes you suspicious of both, but starves you of certainty until you'll follow either one just to move forward. That's the trap, not a plot twist, a behavioral diagnosis. Let's talk about what the doll actually does in this game, because everyone treats her like a helper character, and that's a fundamental misreading. She speaks in childlike fragments, warns you about Foxmask, and positions herself as your ally. But pay attention to when she appears. She shows up at decision thresholds, moments when you're about to commit to a path, and every time she offers information that's technically true but functionally paralyzing. She's not guiding you. She's installing doubt at the exact moment you need confidence. That's a different kind of horror. Not the monster that chases, but the voice that makes you second guess until you freeze. The game uses her child effect to bypass your critical defenses. You listen to her the way you'd listen to a lost kid, but she's not lost. She's positioned. And her warnings about Foxmask might be accurate, but they never include an alternative. She tells you what not to do without ever telling you what to do instead. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Some players report trusting her more than their own instincts by the third act. That's not accident, that's design. F is training you to defer to external narrators because the internal ones, your gut, your pattern recognition, have been systematically degraded by the environment. The doll represents the seductive safety of remaining a child in someone else's story. You don't have to choose if you never grow up. You just follow instructions and blame the instructor when it goes wrong. The most disturbing player confession I've seen. I realized I was waiting for her permission to move. Not because the game forced me to, because I trained myself to want supervision. That's the real mechanic, not jump scares, learned helplessness in a dress. The water sequences in the finale are brutal for this reason. Reflections don't lie in Silent Hill, they accuse. Depending on your route, the surface shows you a version of yourself you thought you'd kept intact. Mirrors are overt. Water is a softer interrogation. F uses it to ask whether your autonomy survived, or if you're just debris circling the groom's orbit. The 1960s aren't an aesthetic pick, it's a pressure point. Showa towns exist in the seam between shrine and neon, rice field and vending machine. NeoBards and Konami wanted 100% Japanese horror. Not just a game set in Japan, but horror that could only function in that cultural context. Producer Motoi Okamoto keeps emphasizing this, and he's pointing at something specific. The unfamiliar feeling isn't exoticism, it's historical friction, the moment when modernity arrives late to a place that never stopped being itself. Classrooms with wood grain and dust, corner stores with nothing to sell. These spaces don't need monsters to feel haunted, they need silence long enough for you to notice that the future didn't ask permission before it arrived. F bottles that silence and lets it ferment. Even combat respects this. You don't power fantasy your way through. You negotiate with a pipe in a space barely wide enough to turn around. You're not mastering systems. You're surviving the mismatch between your body and the room the town wants you to occupy. That's the thesis. You don't conquer change. You endure it poorly in tight corridors with inadequate tools. There's a subset of players who bounced off F hard, and it's worth examining why. Western horror games, especially post-Resident Evil 4, have trained audiences to expect escalation. Threat increases, arsenal expands. You get stronger as the game gets harder, that's the contract. F breaks it. The game front-loads danger. The first bloom sequence is one of the most threatening moments in the entire game. Then it pulls back. Then it advances again, but laterally, not vertically. Threat doesn't increase, it metastasizes. You're not fighting stronger enemies, you're fighting the same corruption in more spaces, including spaces you thought were safe. That's a fundamentally different pacing philosophy, and it reads as boring to players expecting escalation. But the game isn't boring, it's patient. It's betting that dread is more potent than adrenaline, and for players who let it work, the payoff is delayed but deeper. You're not getting a dopamine hit every 10 minutes, you're getting slow burn cortisol that accumulates across hours until you're physically exhausted without any single moment justifying it. That's not failed pacing, that's a different biological target. The cultural gap matters here too. Japanese horror has always favored the slow reveal, the quiet unease, the dread that sits next to you instead of chasing you. Western horror wants the chase. F is betting on the former, and that requires player buy-in that not everyone is willing to give. If you go in expecting RE4 pacing, you'll feel cheated. If you go in expecting Cairo or Noroi pacing, you'll recognize what the game is doing. Here's a perfect case study in how horror communities narrativize fear faster than they fact-check. June 11th, 2025. Silent Hill, WEF banned in Australia, spreads after an IARC database entry shows refused classification. Fans extrapolate. Wedding ritual body horror, child endangerment, gendered violence must have triggered it. The story spreads faster than corrections ever do. June 12th. The Australian Classification Board clarifies F was never refused classification by them. The IARC entry was an error, but database glitch is a worse headline than banned game, so the first story sticks like sap. June 20th to 25th. The board officially rates it MA15+ for strong horror violence, no ban, no restriction beyond age rating. But the rumor becomes lore adjacent to the actual game. We prefer myth to correction, and for a Silent Hill title, that almost feels appropriate. The community ran a parallel ARG in the news cycle without anyone planning it. You can compare this to Silent Hill. Homecoming's actual ban history for contrast, but the point isn't Australia's track record. The point is how quickly we build ghost stories when the imagery is already in our bloodstream. F didn't need manufactured controversy. We wrote it anyway. If you're hunting for a lesser, you'll find echoes, split identity, ritual harm, a town performing your psychology back at you. But here's the elegant move: material substitution. Earlier games forged the otherworld from industry. F grows it from organic matter. Earlier games made denial into rust and metal. F turns acquiescence into silk and stems. The engine is the same. Your inner landscape made external and hostile. The chassis is new. Producer Okamoto keeps clarifying this won't become the new norm, and that's the right call. The core of Silent Hill is the psychological engine. Each entry can dress it in different cultural materials as long as the engine stays loud. F proves the engine doesn't need to scream. It can whisper in a shrine and still drive you out of your body. The practical result: this is the first Silent Hill in years that teaches you something about yourself by watching what you do when a ritual asks politely. It's not trying to out-twist SH2 or outshock Homecoming. It's asking a smaller, sharper question. Who gets your yes when the corridor narrows and the dress looks beautiful? Now let's talk about those endings, because the community is trying to map them to good and bad. That's a category error. These aren't moral outcomes. They're itemized receipts of your decision making across the whole game. The ending you get isn't a judgment, it's a reflection, and some of them are deeply uncomfortable because they show you patterns you didn't think you had. There's one ending, I'm staying vague on purpose, where the protagonist achieves exactly what they wanted at the start. They get the outcome that traditional narrative structure says they should want, and it's horrifying. Because the game shows you the cost in a way that makes you complicit. You got what you reached for. Look at what you touched to get there. Another ending leaves you in ambiguity that borders on gaslighting. You don't know if you're free or if you've just graduated to a more sophisticated form of captivity. The game refuses to confirm. Some players find this intellectually dishonest. Give me the truth. But that's the point. The truth is, you've been asking the wrong questions for 6 hours. And now you don't have time to ask the right ones. The credits roll on unresolved ambiguity, and you have to sit with that. What's brilliant is that the endings aren't locked behind obvious binary choices. The game is tracking smaller things. hesitation duration, camera direction during dialogue, whether you searched the optional areas or rushed toward objectives. It's measuring your priorities through micro behaviors you didn't know were being recorded. That's why players comparing notes often can't figure out what triggered their specific ending. The game was watching things you didn't think mattered. One streamer put it perfectly: "I got the ending I deserved, and I hated that I couldn't argue with it." That's the design goal, not to surprise you, to audit you. That answer will be different for everyone. That's not a flaw, that's the design.